Chicago, of course, was one of the greatest skyscraper cities of the 19th century, but for decades, the city's tallest structures were not the famous loop skyscrapers. They were, in fact, the city's grain elevators. And the greatest skyscraper district in the city, the things that you would see before anything else if you were coming in by a ship from Lake Michigan, were, in fact, these structures that held the agricultural wealth of most of the American Midwest. Like skyscrapers, the grain elevators in Chicago were based in large part on Chicago's status as a place of trade, a place of exchange. Like the main city skyscrapers, they relied on advanced technology, structural technology especially, but a different palette of both materials and structural techniques. They were based, of course, on volume, not on floor area, but nevertheless, some of the same issues that affected the city's commercial high-rises can be seen in the way that the city's grain elevators developed as well. In fact, the comparison between skyscrapers and grain elevators was fairly common in the 19th and early 20th century. Here in 1897, the mayor of Chicago, Carter Harrison, asked about the seven wonders of the city, picks, in fact, the Masonic Temple, then arguably one of the tallest buildings in the world. But right next to it, he says it's the city's great grain elevators that are equal in measure, equal in importance, and equal in their kind of impressiveness, their structural achievement. The city's grain elevators, like the skyscrapers, were based on the Chicago's economy and its status as a place where the agricultural wealth of the Midwest was exchanged. Very early on in its history, Chicago was a place of trade. The proximity of the South Branch of the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River was originally a link between the Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes. But in 1848, when the city funded the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which connected the two rivers with a narrow but navigable passageway, Chicago suddenly had access to much of Western Illinois' agricultural input. And it became really the greatest trading port in the Great Lakes. Before the Illinois and Michigan Canal, it ranked only third or fourth. Kenosha, Wisconsin beat it in terms of grain output. But with the canal, it had access not only to Western Illinois, but also to the Mississippi River and beyond. And very quickly, as this grain began to come through Chicago, it began to pile up, and it needed warehousing. It needed a place where merchants could store it, could wait for buyers from the East Coast. They needed structures basically that could regulate the inflow and outflow so that they could balance the amount of grain coming in with the amount of grain going out. This problem, of course, was exacerbated by the railroads, and in the 1850s and 1860s, when Chicago became the country's most important rail nexus, it suddenly had access not only to hinterland that included Western Illinois, but that included Iowa, Minnesota, the Dakotas, even as far west as Denver and Colorado. And as William Cronin has shown, this hinterland, the gray area on the map, effectively funneled all of its wealth, all of its grain, through the city, around the southern end of Lake Michigan. Much of the grain was transferred from rail to boat to make a more efficient passage to Buffalo and points east. And as Cronin has shown, the way that grain was handled in Chicago was different from St. Louis. In St. Louis, buyers negotiated one-on-one with farmers for sacks of wheat. And in Chicago, the wheat and grain from the northern plains became commodified, became standardized both in terms of its quality and its weight, and was stored instead of in bags in warehouses and eventually in silos and elevators. Now, interestingly, Cronin's book, the cover of Cronin's book, shows this famous 1850s map of Chicago, and right there at the front, at the mouth of the Chicago River, are the two Sturgis and Buckingham, or Illinois Central, grain elevators built in 1855 and 1856. And these, as we'll see, were the kind of signature structures in Chicago's grain trade, the ones that both revolutionized the way the city handled the grain from the Midwest and also the way that it built its elevators. If we zoom out and look at that 1850s map, the bird's eye map of Chicago, we see in the middle the business district, the Loop, but the river looks very, very different than it does today. Instead of tall commercial skyscrapers, the river was really Chicago's port and was its central industrial area. And if you look, you can see that the structures lining the river, warehouses and yes, grain elevators, are much taller, much bigger than any of the buildings in the central business district. Looking through news reports, later Sanborn maps, other popular accounts, we can identify something like 50 grain elevators by 1860 that lined the river and that sprung up wherever railroads and the river intersected. These were places that grain would arrive into the city from the west and the north, where it would be stored and where it would await a lake boat that could take it on east to Buffalo, the Erie Canal, and the markets of New England and the East Coast. The Sturgis and Buckingham elevators were the largest of these, but as you can see, there was a tradition already of grain elevators on the river going back to 1843 with the Newberry and Dole elevator. The original Newberry and Dole, we think this is the one, featured some of the same technologies that we would see in later elevators. A mechanical system for bringing grain up into the air and using gravity then to feed that grain into boats that would carry it on east. You can see that the original Newberry and Dole was simply a warehouse. It had this mechanical arm next to it that allowed for easier transportation, easier handling of grain, storage, and then again using gravity to let the grain drop into boats or wagons that could take it to its final destination. By the 1870s, these had been improved radically, and grain elevators using mechanical means of conveying, of lifting the grain up, and using gravity to let it fall into boats or other wagons. These structures lined the river along with the city's lumber yards and other warehouses. This is the river looking north from about Randolph Street, so today the Civic Opera is on the right. And you can see that the grain elevators are by far the tallest structures on the river, the most advanced structurally as well. The operation of a grain elevator was in some ways similar to a skyscraper. It relied on mechanical conveying systems, at first driven by steam, later by electricity, to move, in this case, goods instead of people up into the structure where the grain would then be graded, weighed, and stored according to its quality. The grain arriving by rail would be shoveled off of cars into hoppers, which would then feed into the elevators proper, these conveyor belts with buckets on them that would haul the grain up to the cupola. And the cupola was really the nerve center of the grain elevator. The grain would first be deposited into a bin called a garner. A certain number of bushels would then be discharged into a weighing bin. The grain would be weighed according to and its weight compared with its volume. An expert in grain quality would sample it, would grade the grain, and then according to what that sampler decided, the grain would be directed to one of several bins. So that bin would have grain of all the same quality. It wouldn't matter where it came from, which farm it came from. Anyone buying it would know that they had a grain of a certain quality, no matter who the original grower was. Once it was determined what quality the grain was, it would go into one of these bins, these giant bins that again would store the grain, and at the bottom you can see there are hoppers that would discharge that grain again into an elevator, a conveyor that would pick it up, and eventually would bring it over and discharge it into a marine leg or chute. And these chutes then would discharge into boats that would travel down the river out into the lake and to markets points east. Maybe the greatest similarity between grain elevators and skyscrapers was in fact the literal elevators, the conveyor belts, usually made of rubber with metal buckets on them that would literally pick up the grain and elevate it to the cupola, and then after it had been stored for a while, would lift it up into the conveying system that would end in the marine chutes. These again were driven often by steam and later by electricity. And one of the interesting things about the conveying systems is that they ran constantly. They moved grain throughout the elevators not only to bring them up to the cupola or to the top of a marine chute, but actually to stir the grain up, to prevent moisture from building up and the grain rotting. Here, late 1880s, 1890s view of one of the cupolas, where you see traders connected by telegraph on the left, and on the right, the kind of heart of the grain elevator, these giant chutes that are taking grain from the garners above, and depending on what the grader has decided for that batch of grain, they're distributing it to one of many bins below. And you can see in this case, the chute is discharging into this particular bin. If the grain is of a different quality, that chute rotates. It moves around and discharges the grain into one of the other ones. And here, slightly later, marine chutes working by gravity, taking grain again from the top of the elevator. It's been brought up there by these mechanical conveying systems and just simply falling into the hold of a ship. And you can see on the right the velocity of the grain coming out of the chute, guaranteeing that it's going to fill the entire hull of one of these lake boats. Now, grain elevators, even more than skyscrapers, were kind of gadgets. They were machines that literally stored grain, graded it, moved it around. And the perfection of the grain elevator in the 19th century really came about as the result of a Chicago builder named Joseph T. Moulton. Moulton was originally from New Hampshire. He moved to Chicago in the 1850s and very quickly took a job in a grain elevator, learning basically how it worked, how it was put together. He then began a career as a builder. He essentially put together grain elevators, developed systems that integrated some of these mechanical conveyors, and would go on to build Chicago's largest and most important grain elevators, the kind of nerve center of the city's grain industry. His son, George Moulton, continued the firm through the 1890s and expanded it into skyscraper construction, of all things. So the Fisher Building in Chicago, the Guarantee Building in Buffalo were both built by the Moulton Company, a company that got its start with grain elevators. Moulton's genius was to combine available techniques to make these structures more and more efficient, both to build and to operate. He looked at foundation construction, perfected a technique of friction piles that use the hydrostatic pressure of otherwise very poor riverside soil to grip onto timber logs, provide the friction necessary to hold the tremendous weight of these grain bins up. On the left, you can see limestone caps being placed over a collection of friction piles that will then form the basis on the right for these massive timber structures that are going to lift the bins up over, you can see the railroad tracks that are paralleling the river, but in this case, of course, right next to the river, right? So the grain is coming in by rail from the west. It's going to be lifted into the elevator and discharged into boats in the river that are taking it out east. On top of this heavy timber structure was Moulton's real genius. And this was a method of timber construction that in some ways combines timber with masonry techniques to build these giant cellular bins. These are grain elevators in New York, not Chicago, but built by Moulton. And if you look closely, you can begin to see the texture of the bins is lumber, but not lumber in the way we're used to seeing it laid. In fact, what Moulton did was to lay the timber on its side and to give those timber walls some strength and bending so that they could take the bursting pressure, the hydrostatic pressure of hundreds and hundreds of tons of grain in each one of these bins pressing outward at the base. And you can see that these are timbers that are laid up essentially like masonry on their flat sides, not on their ends, so that they basically all function as beams turned on their side. This worked, of course, because Chicago was not only at the center of the nation's greatest grain industry, but also at the center of its greatest timber industry. And those lumber yards that were interspersed with grain elevators on the Chicago riverfront provided the raw material for Moulton to build these elevator structures. Here on the right, this is actually the wrecking of the Illinois Central elevators, the Sturgis and Buckingham structures at the mouth of the river, and you can see the incredible amount of lumber that went into these kind of timber masonry bins going up. Those two elevators, Sturgis and Buckingham A and B at the mouth of the river, were really the signature structures of Chicago's grain trade for years and years. They were visited not only by reporters, but also by royalty. Visitors from the British royal family to Chicago in the 1860s wanted to see the massive grain elevators at work. Anthony Trollope referred to them as these giant, hungry animals at the mouth of the river, almost a sort of hellish combination of sound and dust, working away to store the grain and to discharge it onto these ships heading east. The A and B were also Moulton's kind of greatest or most kind of signature achievements in integrating these mechanical systems, the conveying systems that brought the grain up to the cupola, that allowed graders to sample the grain, to weigh it, and then to discharge it into these dozens of bins according to its quality. This was the kind of system perfected, and they really set the standard, these two elevators, for the remainder of Chicago's 19th century grain structures. Moulton's elevators for Sturgis and Buckingham weren't only well constructed and very cleverly engineered, they were also fortuitously located. In the 1871 fire, because they were so close to the mouth, only one of the elevators was actually lost. The other one survived. Most of Chicago's elevators that had been located along the main branch were destroyed as the fire swept northward. But because the elevators were located not necessarily around the loop, but wherever major rail lines interfaced with the river, many of the city's elevators actually survived the fire, located further west at the confluence of the North and South Branch, or further south on the South Branch, where railroads from the west, from Iowa and the Dakotas, merged with the river. In fact, by the 1870s, there were only a handful of elevators along the main branch. They'd largely been squeezed out by other boatyards and warehouses. And in fact, the greatest elevator district was further south, where the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad came in, and where the Rock Island Railroad came in. These were the railroads that headed west to the growing agricultural hinterland of the upper Midwest. Now, this kind of neighborhood of elevators was largely founded and largely built by an entrepreneur named George Armour, who had been a contractor for parts of both the Illinois and Michigan Canal and the early railroads going west, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and the Rock Island. He's alleged maybe to have built the first steam power grain elevator in the 1850s, and he was also a grain trader. So he not only helped build the infrastructure, he also made money on speculation on the grain trade. His connections with the railroad meant that when he decided to get into the elevator business, he had natural connections, and he was a bit of a ruthless entrepreneur. He took advantage of the bankruptcy of one of his rivals to take over their network of elevators and to build this little empire on the South Branch. He was also the first of many elevator operators and families to be a great philanthropist. And the extra profits gained from the elevator business, very, very low risk to simply store grain instead of risking growing it or shipping it, meant that he, along with many of his colleagues, became some of the city's greatest philanthropists. Armour's empire was along the South Branch. And here he built a handful of elevators that took grain exclusively from the CB&Q and from the Rock Island and discharged it into purpose-built slips and docks far to the south, where there was much more space than there had been along the main branch of the river. Here at about West 22nd Street in the river are his C&D elevators, along with another one across the river, the Chicago and St. Louis, that he owned as well. And he was involved also with a series of elevators at a bend in the river that's since been straightened out. The sites of these elevators are now actually underwater. the Rock Island A and B and the Iowa elevators, here seen in the 1890s, and here from Sanborn maps, showing just the density of these elevators in these neighborhoods. And you can see both the proximity of the elevators to the river itself, and also how they really do interface between the railroads, the shipping of grain from out west, and the river, which is going to provide the space for the lake boats to dock and take the grain out further east. Now, it's around this time, and partly with armor, that the connections between elevators and the Board of Trade really deepen. The Board of Trade begins as a self-organized organization among grain merchants in the 1840s, and it comes about just at the time when the telegraph allows the trading not only of grain but also of so-called futures contracts. These are initially developed basically as insurance for farmers, as guarantees for prices that will encourage farmers out in the Midwest to grow no matter what the outlook looks like. They're promises to purchase a certain amount of grain at a later date. Eventually, these kind of evolve or metastasize, depending on your point of view, into their own commodities. And traders on the Board of Trade begin to specialize not only in trading grain itself, but in trading futures contracts for grain. And so they can make a ton of money, not only if the price goes up, but if they're clever and they take advantage of changes in the weather or problems with transportation, they can make a lot of money too, even if the price goes down. They can short sell. And one of the great endeavors of some of these traders on the Board of Trade is to try to what's called corner the market, where if you believe that the price of grain is going to go up, you sell futures contracts to people who think the price is going to go down, and at the same time you hoard the grain itself. You buy the grain itself, so that those bears, the traders betting that the price is going to go down, when the futures contracts come due, have no choice but to first buy from you at an inflated price, and then to sell the grain back to you at a much, much lower price because of the futures contract. With this, it's possible to force truly extortionate pricing. And in a successfully run corner, the bullish trader, the person running the corner, would not only be able to make vast fortunes, but would be able to bankrupt his competitors. And with the threat of jail looming, would be able to take over actually their competitors' businesses. There's a quirk in Illinois state law that requires futures contracts, however, to be settled in actual grain. Even if the traders never see the grain itself, there has to be a quantity of grain somewhere that can be exchanged, even if it's just on paper. And this is one of the greatest markets that grain elevators ever see, because now not only are they holding grain for merchants to sell out east, they're holding grain for traders to make these million-dollar deals, and often these bankrupting corners over one another. These become some of the great dramas of the late 19th century. And the Chicago newspapers are full of front-page news on the price of wheat in the Dakotas, or the future price of wheat in the Dakotas. And especially when news of a corner attempt makes the headlines, it becomes something that essentially stops the whole city. It's the greatest drama that Chicago has ever seen. People make and lose fortunes, people make and lose their businesses. The kind of financial buccaneering that goes on the Board of Trade becomes a sort of proxy entertainment for the entire city. And as a result, because the physical storage of grain is so important to these financial endeavors, the amount of storage capacity in Chicago skyrockets. It more than quadruples between the 1870s and the 1890s. Some of this is the population growth on the East Coast and the growing market for grain, but certainly not all of it. A good bit of it is just the amount of space that's required to be a successful speculator in grain. And the same kind of boom that we see in grain elevators is paralleled by the real estate booms that we see building skyscrapers taller and taller. Here it's about volume to store grain instead of about the amount of floor area one can rent. But you can see that there's a similar curve throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s as there is in the growth of skyscrapers in American cities. Now, into this wanders the greatest kind of financial buccaneer in Chicago's history, the slightly confusingly named Philip Danforth Armour, who is no relation to George Armour, the original elevator speculator. But Armour is instead a pure financial kind of wizard. He begins his career by betting against pork prices at the end of the Civil War. And when the armies demobilize after the surrender, he makes a fortune basically sinking other meat packers by undercutting their prices. He starts taking over other organizations, other companies, eventually consolidating his operations in Chicago. And by the 1880s, he's maybe a little bit bored with his meatpacking success, and he sets his eyes on the wheat market. Armour builds basically financial fortifications in the form of grain elevators on the northern half of Goose Island, this island in the north branch of Chicago's rivers. And he does this very intentionally because here he has access to rail lines, not to the west, not to western Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, but instead to the northwest, to Minnesota and the Dakotas. And this wheat is already coming into Chicago, but Armour basically capitalizes on the position of Goose Island in the city to be able to better capture the agriculture coming in the railroads. And you can see the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, the Chicago and Northwestern, both go right by Goose Island. And so this is the perfect place to take wheat from the Northwest, the Great Plains, and transfer it onto lake boats in Chicago's North Branch of the river. Now, Armour isn't just interested in selling wheat to the eastern markets, though. He's interested in cornering the wheat market in Chicago, and he does this in three great campaigns. One of them, maybe the greatest one, against the Leiter family, the son of Levi Leiter, the merchant who commissioned William LeBaron Jenney to build a store and a warehouse in the 1870s and 1880s. The younger Leiter is a classic mark. He bets on the price going down. Armour takes his bets, secretly hoards grain, and most importantly, secretly expands his grain elevator empire on Goose Island, building what are called 30-day elevators in the press, building them with molten so quickly, in less than a month, that Leiter doesn't really know what's going on until it's too late. Armour not only brings in wheat from the Northwest by rail, but in the middle of winter, he hires a fleet of icebreakers to open up the port in Duluth, and he brings wheat into Chicago by ship through the Great Lakes. He has installed the marine legs on these elevators to run backwards. And for basically the first time, Chicago is actually importing wheat from the lake instead of exporting it via the lake. So all of this is this huge surprise. And it's this great story. The Chicago Tribune picks it up. This is a dramatic thing to see the boats full of Armour's wheat sailing up the Chicago River. Leiter realizes that he is bankrupted. But these episodes have literal monuments to memorialize them. And these are Armour's A and B elevators, which he builds in 1887, and then the B Annex, which he builds in 1893. And you can see that the A and B, these are the biggest elevators that Chicago's ever built. They are right literally on the river. The B Annex is literally for hoarding grain and corner attempts, and it is actually inland, connected to the river only by these quarter-mile long conveyor belts. The financial warfare is something that is kind of wildly entertaining, but it's also sort of the swan song for cornering attempts and for elevators' positions as elements of sort of fiscal warfare. Here, an illustrated version of the Leiter corner attempt, Armour in his office on the left, the trade routes that he takes advantage of by hiring these icebreakers. And then at right, you can see the grain vessels that have come from Duluth waiting in line to offload into the A and B elevators, thus bankrupting Leiter, assuring Armour's place in the history of Chicago's grain trade. The A and B elevators and the B Annex are also kind of the swan songs for the great timber elevators in Chicago. And throughout all of this, you may be wondering, well, the combination of grain dust and dry timber clearly didn't help Sturgis and Buckingham in 1871. And were these elevators as dangerous as they sound? And the answer is yes. These elevators burned all the time. They were insured, and of course the fact that they're losing only grain and that people aren't usually dying, losing their lives in these fires, meant that grain elevators weren't regulated quite as tightly as skyscrapers. The requirements for construction, clearly not as great, but they were regulated in terms of where they could be built in the city and what they could be near, because the dry timber of a grain elevator and this explosive dust within meant that these actually went up in flames quite a bit. And it's right around the turn of the century that Chicago engineers in particular start to look at Moulton's technique and to wonder if, particularly with timber resources in the Midwest sort of dwindling, with fires being a continual problem, whether there are other materials that might work better. For a while, steel is a favored material for elevators, but it has problems with condensation that leads to rot on the interior. And it's really concrete that emerges as the kind of perfectly suited material, both to grain's potential flammability and to the hydrostatic pressure that these tall columns of fluid grain create. Initial experiments in Chicago occur as early as 1899. Illinois Steel builds concrete silos to store materials, not grain. And it's Peavey, a grain merchant in Minneapolis, who first builds so-called Peavey's Folly, still extant on the west side of Minneapolis, and eventually a series of working grain elevators in Duluth out of concrete silos, concrete cylinders around the turn of the century. Here in Chicago, an engineering firm called the John Metcalf Company builds concrete grain silos outside of Indianapolis. But it's really the firm of Jason McDonald and Company that perfect the concrete grain silo and go on to build elevators not only in Chicago, but throughout the Midwest and eventually all over the world. McDonald's great innovation, and one that would have huge implications for concrete skyscraper construction later in the 20th century, was the slip form, a moving form that could basically excrete a cylindrical silo as it climbed. So on the left, you can see wooden forms that workmen will pour concrete into from the top. And every few hours, they'll release the forms, jack them up just a little bit, and time it so that the concrete emerging from the bottom of the form has cured to full strength. Well, at the top of the form, there's still room to pour fresh concrete in. And so these cylindrical slip forms, climbing at a few feet per day maybe, basically are the most economical way to build what ends up being the most efficient structural shape for grain silos. These cylinders that can be reinforced with circular hoops of steel to take the bursting pressure of the grain within. McDonald works for Metcalf for a while, and together they build the silos for the Santa Fe elevator at Damon and the Chicago River. They build them, the first silos, as a kind of adjunct to a wooden elevator that exists. That wooden elevator eventually burns, and it is rebuilt, not surprisingly, in concrete. And you can see that within the concrete shell, the mechanics are still very much the same as they have been since the days of Moulton. Conveyor belts that move buckets of grain, that pick them up from rail cars, deposit them into bins, and then pick them up again from the bottom of the bins, carry them up to the top, and use gravity to load boats and ships on the Chicago River. That location is a bit of an anomaly. That's still on the South Branch. And by the 1920s, with efforts to remove shipping from the main branch in the downtown area of the Chicago River to other parts of the city, the grain elevators move as well. And in particular, this harbor project that gets developed on the south side, Calumet River, Calumet Harbor, becomes the place where the concrete grain elevator really establishes itself in Chicago. This is about 8 or 9 miles south of the Loop. The city invests in improving the port facilities along the Calumet River, in part so that they can turn the river into the grand set of boulevards that it is today. Wacker Drive opens in 1922, and it's only after all of that shipping has moved south to the Calumet district that's possible. The other thing that happens is that Chicago expands its river capacity by, in 1922, building a channel that essentially bypasses the lower part of the Chicago River. It takes all of the ship traffic from the Illinois River, the Des Plaines River, and reroutes it through the Calumet district. Improvements to the harbor there mean that grain can come either by rail or by boat, can transfer at the Calumet elevators onto lake boats that then take it east, as they've always done. The other thing that happens around this time is that the railroads also come together and form a belt railway, so that rail traffic no longer needs to come all the way into downtown. It can circumvent the congestion, the traffic that occurs around the loop, and it too can go straight to the Calumet district to unload grain into elevators that'll go onto those same lake boats heading east. The greatest of these Calumet elevators is the Chicago and Northwestern, which is built in 1917, the largest grain elevator on the planet at the time, and the greatest sort of single hub for grain transfer, not only in the city, but anywhere in North America. The Chicago and Northwestern is famous not only for being big, it was also famous for proving that concrete was no guarantee against grain dust exploding. And in fact, just a few years after it opened, one of the biggest explosions in city history, one that shattered windows across Lake Michigan, allegedly, occurred in the cupola of the Chicago and Northwestern. And among other things, it proved that concrete was not only a fireproof material, but also durable enough to withstand such an explosion. And you can see that the silos survived largely intact. And in fact, the cupola was rebuilt and the elevator continued to be used up through the 1990s. Today, the legacy of the grain elevator in Chicago has almost entirely disappeared from the skyline. There are a handful of concrete elevators left. McDonald's Santa Fe system elevator on South Damon, even though it suffered fires and was abandoned in the 1970s, still stands as a ruin next to the river. And a later generation of concrete elevators around Lake Calumet, including the Illinois Grain and the Rice Company elevator, both still stand and are in fact still used. There are scattered archaeological bits of elevators, including a rare steel one in the Calumet district, and a handful of remnants of timber or concrete elevators throughout the city. But for the most part, the 300 or so grain elevators that were built in the last half of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, have entirely disappeared. Their legacy, though, lives on in other ways. Because grain storage was such a lucrative business, what we find is that the city is dotted with the philanthropical sort of archaeology of the grain trade. In particular, Buckingham Fountain in Grant Park was donated to the city by the Buckingham family, who had made their money with the Sturgis and Buckingham Company and the two elevators at the mouth of the river. Philip Armour, went on to invest much of his winnings from the corner attempts into a new educational institution, the Armour Institute on the South Side, which was formed in 1893 with a donation of $1 million that Armour had just won from one of these corner battles. The Armour Institute, of course, today is IIT. And finally, the Rice Company, who owned one of the big, still extant elevators on Lake Calumet, were donors for the Rice wing of the Art Institute of Chicago, among other things. So even though the physical manifestations of Chicago's grain elevators had disappeared, much like skyscrapers, we see that the profits that they turned have been reinvested in other ways in the city. And these elevator families live on in name, if not in monument, in other places. When we look at elevators in conjunction with skyscrapers, we see things that are both the same, and we see important distinctions as well. The race for height involved similar investigations into materials, into structural technologies, into foundations. Dankmar Adler in the 1890s noted that the friction piles that Moulton had used for his riverside grain elevators probably would have worked well under skyscrapers if Chicago architects and engineers had seen fit to use them. Adler went on, of course, to develop caisson foundations, which are a sort of variant of pile foundations that rely on bearing instead of friction. And grain elevators almost certainly played some role in his thinking through the potential transfer of caissons from bridge technology into skyscraper technology. The conveying systems in grain elevators, even though very different in appearance from passenger elevators in skyscrapers, nevertheless relied on some of the same materials. And the transition from steam to electric was similar in skyscrapers and elevators as a way to power their conveyances. And finally, the sort of drive to height and the concerns about fire led to material changes in skyscrapers several decades before those in elevators. And that, I think, is largely due to the fact that we worry much more about human safety than we do about the safety of grain, that human casualties were taken much more seriously, much sooner. And therefore, in the 1870s, we begin to see legislation in the city that requires fireproofing, whereas the political power of elevator operators meant that there were few restrictions on the materials that grain elevators could be built with until the turn of the century, when concrete became widely available. Chicago's other skyscrapers, I think, thus deserve attention as almost a sort of foil to skyscraper history, another way that speculators profited off of location, off of size, off of height, but did so in a way that more directly reflected the commodities flowing into and through not just the city, but through the structures they built along the river and eventually throughout the region.